Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: Echoes of the Haunted Keys. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the school parking lot as students climbed into the bus for their eagerly awaited Louisiana tour. Emily Harper, a quiet but observant 8th grader, found her seat near the back, clutching her notebook. Her class had been buzzing about this trip for weeks, a chance to explore the rich history and culture of southern Louisiana. The highlight of the itinerary, Myrtle's plantation, loomed in her mind like a shadow. She had overheard stories in the hallways, tales of ghost sightings, strange noises, and unnerving experiences that previous visitors had claimed to witness. Though Emily wasn't one to believe in such things, the thought of stepping into a place so steeped in folklore unsettled her. "Emily," Rachel called from across the aisle, breaking her train of thought. "You've got that serious face again. Are you nervous?" "No," Emily replied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about the plantation. You know, the haunted one." Rachel laughed. "You mean the one where people claim to hear music at night? Don't worry. It's all just stories to scare tourists. It'll be fun." Emily nodded but turned back to the window, watching the scenery blur as the bus rumbled toward their destination. By the time they arrived at Myrtle's plantation, the sun was high, casting harsh light on the sprawling grounds. The plantation house stood tall, its weathered exterior and grand veranda exuding an eerie elegance. Ancient oak trees, their branches tangled with moss, framed the property. The air felt heavier here, and Emily couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. The tour guide, a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor and piercing eyes, greeted the group. "Welcome to Myrtle's plantation," she began, her voice steady. "This home has stood since 1796, and its walls hold the stories of those who lived, and some say linger, here." Emily exchanged a glance with Rachel, who rolled her eyes. The guide's tone carried an ominous weight that made Emily's skin prickle. As the group filed into the house, Emily lingered at the back, her gaze drawn to the upstairs windows. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow passing behind the glass. But when she looked again, it was gone. The interior of the house was both beautiful and unnerving. The furniture, polished and pristine, seemed frozen in time, and the air carried the faint scent of wood polish and age. As they walked through the rooms, the guide recounted the history of the plantation. Emily listened intently, trying to focus on the historical details, but her attention kept drifting. Something about the house made her uneasy. The group entered a parlor room where the centerpiece was an antique grand piano. The guide explained its significance, mentioning that it had been in the house for over a century. Emily found herself drawn to the instrument. It stood silent, its keys gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the window, yet it seemed to hum with energy. As the guide continued her story, Emily's ears caught a faint, sharp sound, a single piano key being struck. She froze, her gaze darting to the piano, but no one else seemed to notice. Dismissing it as her imagination, she turned back to the group. The sound came again, a soft, deliberate note like a child testing the keys. Emily glanced at Rachel, who appeared engrossed in the guide's words. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered. "Hear what?" Rachel asked, looking confused. Emily hesitated. "Never mind." But the noise persisted. Each time it came, her pulse quickened. She began to scan the room, searching for anything out of place. Everyone seemed focused on the guide. Everyone except for one woman standing near the back. Emily locked eyes with her. The woman tilted her head and gestured subtly to her ear, her expression questioning. Emily nodded. Relief washed over her. Someone else had heard it. Before she could say anything, the guide's voice cut through her thoughts. "This piano has a fascinating history," she said, her tone conspiratorial. "Many guests have reported hearing it play when no one is near. Some say it's the wind, others the imagination. But one thing's for sure, it always leaves an impression. As the group moved on, Emily lingered by the piano. The rest of the tour faded into the background as her curiosity took hold. She traced her fingers along the keys but didn't press them. They felt cold beneath her touch, almost as if the instrument resisted her presence. "Did you really hear it?" a voice asked. Emily turned to see the woman from earlier. Up close, she seemed even more unsettled, her eyes darting around the room. "Yes," Emily admitted. "Did you?" The woman nodded. "My name's Margaret. I've been here before, and this isn't the first time I've heard it. My husband and son think I'm imagining things, but I know what I heard." Emily felt a strange camaraderie with Margaret, as though their shared experience bound them in an unspoken pact. They exchanged only a few more words before the group moved on, but the connection lingered. By the time the tour ended, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the plantation. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them out. As the group gathered near the bus, Margaret approached her again. "Do you feel it?" Margaret asked in a low voice. Emily hesitated. "Feel what?" "The heaviness, like the house doesn't want us to leave." Emily shivered but didn't reply. She boarded the bus with the others, but her thoughts remained in the parlor room, with the piano and its haunting notes. That night, Emily struggled to sleep in their hotel room. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the piano. The sound of the single key echoed in her mind, relentless and unnerving. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, a creaking floorboard, a draft, but deep down, she couldn't believe it. Across the room, Rachel stirred. "Emily, are you awake?" "Yes," Emily whispered. "I can't stop thinking about that plantation. Did anything seem off to you?" Emily hesitated, debating whether to share her experience. "Maybe. It's an old house. It's bound to feel strange." Rachel didn't reply, but Emily could tell she was still awake. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until finally, sleep took them both. The next morning, Emily woke with a sense of determination. She needed to understand what had happened at Myrtle's plantation. Gathering her courage, she decided to approach Margaret during breakfast. "Margaret," she said quietly, "do you think we could go back, just to see if we notice anything else?" Margaret's eyes widened. "I was thinking the same thing, but we'd have to be careful. The staff wouldn't like us wandering around after hours." As they began to hatch a plan, Emily couldn't help but wonder what they might find. Would the piano remain silent, or would it reveal its secrets once more? The breakfast room buzzed with the usual energy of a school trip. Students exchanged laughter and anecdotes from the previous day. Their excitement focused on the lighter, more enjoyable moments of the tour. But Emily's attention was elsewhere. Across the room, Margaret sat with her husband and son, her expression thoughtful as she sipped her coffee. Emily nudged Rachel. "I need to talk to Margaret again. Want to come?" Rachel frowned. "What for?" "I think there's something we missed at the plantation." Margaret heard it too, the piano. "She's curious, just like me." Rachel hesitated. "Emily, maybe you're overthinking this. It was probably nothing." "Then come with me and prove it," Emily said, her tone more challenging than she intended. Reluctantly, Rachel agreed, and the two approached Margaret's table. After a brief conversation, Margaret's husband shook his head. "You two are really going to drag my wife into this ghost story nonsense again? You all need to let it go." Margaret gave him a dismissive look. "I don't need permission to be curious. If we can find a way back to the plantation, I'm going." Emily felt a swell of determination. This was no longer just about satisfying her curiosity. It was about proving to herself that the unease she felt wasn't unfounded. By mid-afternoon, Margaret, Emily, and Rachel had managed to arrange a taxi ride back to Myrtle's plantation. Their school group was scheduled to visit another historic site that afternoon, but the girls convinced their chaperone that they were feeling under the weather and needed to rest. Rachel's unease was clear, but she followed anyway, unwilling to let Emily go alone. When they arrived, the plantation grounds looked different in the daylight. The heavy shadows of the previous evening were replaced with a golden glow from the afternoon sun, but the air carried the same oppressive weight. They approached the main house where a different guide was giving a tour. Margaret leaned toward Emily. "We can't follow the tour group without raising suspicion. Let's explore the grounds first." Emily nodded, and they veered away from the house, heading toward the gardens. The trees here seemed taller, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The sound of crunching gravel underfoot was the only noise, amplifying the silence that hung between them. As they walked deeper into the grounds, they stumbled upon a small, fenced-in area overgrown with weeds. A crooked wooden sign read Family Cemetery. Emily felt her stomach knot. The graves were old, their headstones weathered to the point of being illegible. Margaret pointed to a patch of earth that seemed oddly disturbed. The soil was slightly sunken, and no marker identified who or what might be buried there. Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It could just be erosion," Margaret suggested, though her tone betrayed doubt. Emily crouched near the patch, her fingers brushing the loose dirt. A faint smell lingered in the air. Not quite decay, but earthy and unsettling. She stood abruptly, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Let's keep moving." After circling the grounds, the trio decided to re-enter the house. Margaret had mentioned an old contact who worked as a caretaker there, and with some persuasion they were able to gain access without joining the official tour. The inside of the plantation house was eerily quiet. The polished floors creaked under their weight as they moved from room to room. The parlor, with its grand piano, drew them like a magnet. Emily hesitated at the doorway. The piano looked exactly as it had the day before, but now, in the silence, its presence felt more imposing. Margaret stepped forward, running her hand along its edge. "No notes today," she said softly, as if addressing the instrument. Rachel crossed her arms. "See? Nothing. Can we go now?" But Emily wasn't ready to leave. She walked to the far corner of the room, where an old cabinet stood. Something about it seemed out of place, though she couldn't pinpoint why. She opened the doors cautiously. Inside were stacks of sheet music, yellowed with age. Most were classical pieces, but one caught her eye. The sheet bore the title Lament for the Soldier. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, as if whoever had written it had been in a hurry. Emily shivered as she picked it up. "Look at this," she said, showing it to Margaret. Margaret studied it, her brow furrowing. "I've never heard of this piece. Do you think it belonged to someone here?" "Maybe," Emily replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Something about the music unsettled her, and she carefully placed it back. As they prepared to leave the parlor, a sudden creak echoed through the room. All three froze. The sound hadn't come from them, it had come from the piano bench. Slowly they turned to look. The bench had shifted, ever so slightly, as if someone had just risen from it. "Let's go," Rachel hissed, pulling at Emily's arm. But Margaret held her ground. "Wait, did you feel that? Like the air moved?" Emily nodded, though her legs felt rooted to the spot. The room seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible vibration, and the hair on her arms stood on end. "I don't want to wait to find out what's next," Rachel said, her voice breaking. Reluctantly, they left the room, though Emily cast one last glance at the piano before stepping into the hallway. She could have sworn she saw the keys glinting, as if touched by invisible hands. Margaret's contact, an elderly man named Henry, met them near the kitchen. He was wiry, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You shouldn't be wandering this house unsupervised," he said, his voice low. "There are stories here, things people don't understand." Margaret frowned. "You've worked here for years. What do you think is happening?" Henry hesitated before answering. "I've heard things, seen things I can't explain, especially in the parlor. If you're wise, you'll leave that room alone." "But the piano," Emily began. Henry held up a hand. "Enough. Some things are better left undisturbed." His warning hung in the air as they left the kitchen. Emily's mind raced with questions, but the look in Henry's eyes told her he wouldn't say more. As they prepared to leave the plantation, Emily realized she had left her notebook in the parlor. Against Rachel's protests, she insisted on retrieving it. Margaret offered to go with her, leaving Rachel to wait by the taxi. The parlor felt colder than before. Emily quickly spotted her notebook on a side table and grabbed it. But as they turned to leave, Margaret noticed something unusual. One of the piano's keys was pressed down just slightly. "That wasn't like that before," Margaret whispered. Emily swallowed hard. She reached out to touch the key but stopped short when she felt a sudden, sharp chill. It wasn't fear, it was something deeper, more primal. "Let's go," Margaret urged, her voice shaking. They left the house without another word. As the taxi pulled away from the plantation, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they had stirred something. Margaret sat in silence, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Even Rachel, who had been skeptical from the start, seemed subdued. "Do you think it's real?" Emily finally asked. Margaret looked at her, her expression unreadable. "I don't know, but I don't think it's finished with us." The words sent a chill down Emily's spine. She turned to look out the window, the plantation disappearing into the distance. Yet, the image of the piano, with its single pressed key, lingered in her mind, refusing to fade. The ride back from the plantation was silent. Rachel stared out the window, her face pale and drawn. Margaret fidgeted with the strap of her bag, while Emily's mind buzzed with unspoken questions. What had they stumbled into? Why did the piano feel like a tether to something unseen? That night, Emily sat on her hotel bed, her notebook open. She scribbled down everything she could remember. The faint sound of the piano, the strange cold in the parlor, the caretaker's cryptic warning. The pieces didn't add up, but one thing was clear. They needed answers. Across the room, Rachel sighed heavily. "Are we really going back tomorrow? I mean, what are we even looking for?" "Clarity," Emily replied without looking up. "Don't you want to understand what we heard?" "I want to move on," Rachel muttered. "This whole thing feels wrong." The next morning, Margaret suggested they visit the local library. If the plantation's history held any clues, old records might reveal them. The library was small, its air thick with the scent of aged paper. Emily approached the reference desk, explaining their interest in Myrtle's plantation. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes, raised an eyebrow. "You're not the first to ask about that place," she said, pulling out a worn binder. "People come here looking for ghost stories. Most leave disappointed." "We're not looking for ghost stories," Margaret interjected. "We want facts." The librarian's expression softened. "Then you'll want the archives. Follow me." She led them to a dimly lit room where stacks of brittle newspapers and ledgers awaited. Hours passed as they sifted through accounts of the plantation's past. Emily's fingers brushed across an article dated 1897. The headline read, "Local soldier mourned. Tragic death at Myrtle's plantation." Her heart raced as she scanned the text. The article detailed the life and untimely death of Charles Beauregard, a Confederate soldier and musician. He had returned to the plantation after the war, seeking solace in music. According to the piece, Charles was found dead at the piano, his hands resting on the keys. The cause of death was never determined. Margaret read over Emily's shoulder. "Do you think it's him? The soldier the guide mentioned?" "It has to be," Emily replied. But the article raised more questions than answers. What had drawn Charles to the piano in his final moments? And why did his presence still seem to linger? That evening, Margaret arranged to meet Henry, the caretaker, at a nearby diner. Over coffee and pie, he reluctantly opened up about his experiences at the plantation. "I've worked there for nearly 20 years, Henry said, his voice low. "I've seen lights flicker, heard footsteps when no one's there. But the piano, that's different. It's not just sounds. It's an energy." Margaret leaned forward. "What kind of energy?" Henry hesitated. "It feels like someone's trying to communicate, but it's not always friendly." Emily's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Henry sighed. "A few years ago, a guest ignored the signs and tried to play the piano. said he wanted to see if the stories were true. The next morning, he was gone. His wife found him outside, sitting under one of the oak trees, staring into space. He couldn't speak for 3 days. The table fell silent. Rachel broke it with a nervous laugh. "You're kidding, right?" Henry's gaze was steady. "I wish I was." The following day, they returned to the plantation, determined to approach the mystery with fresh eyes. This time, they joined an official tour, blending in with a group of tourists. The guide's voice droned on about the architecture and infamous legends, but Emily's focus was elsewhere. As they entered the parlor, Emily noticed something strange. The piano, which had been spotless before, now bore a single smudge on its glossy surface. She nudged Margaret, who nodded in silent acknowledgement. The guide began recounting the story of Charles Beauregard. As he described the soldier's tragic death, Emily felt a faint vibration underfoot. Her breath hitched. Was it just her imagination, or was the floor trembling slightly? A loud bang shattered the moment. The group turned toward the source of the noise. A picture frame had fallen from the wall. The guide chuckled nervously. "Must be the humidity," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Emily exchanged a glance with Margaret. Something was shifting, and they were running out of time to figure out what it was. After the tour, Emily lingered in the parlor while the others moved on. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on a small drawer built into the piano's base. She knelt and tugged it open, revealing a bundle of yellowed papers. Among them was a letter addressed to "Dearest Clarabelle." Emily unfolded the fragile document, her hands trembling. The letter was dated shortly before Charles's death and spoke of his regret and sorrow over choices made during the war. One line stood out. "The melody haunts me, a reminder of what I've lost." Margaret appeared at her side. "What did you find?" Emily handed her the letter. "It's from Charles, to someone named Clarabelle." Margaret's brow furrowed. Maybe she was his wife or lover. But why would he leave this here? Before Emily could respond, Rachel called from the hallway. "Guys, you need to see this." Rachel led them to a door they hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase leading to the attic. "No way this was on the tour," Rachel said. Against their better judgment, they climbed the narrow stairs. The attic was stifling, filled with discarded furniture and boxes. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chair, its legs uneven on the warped floorboards. A layer of dust coated everything, except the chair. Margaret approached cautiously. "It's like someone's been sitting here." Emily's gaze fell on the floor beneath the chair. Scratched into the wood were the faint outlines of musical notes. Back in the parlor, Emily placed the letter on the piano and hesitated before pressing one of the keys. The note rang out sharp and clear. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint draft swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of tobacco. Margaret gasped, but Emily stood her ground. "Charles," she whispered, "if you're here, we just want to understand." The room fell silent. Emily's heart pounded as she waited for a response. None came, but as they turned to leave, the piano let out a soft, mournful chord. Outside, they sat on the steps, shaken but resolute. Margaret broke the silence. "I think he's trapped here. Not in some supernatural way, but by his own guilt." Emily nodded. The letter, the music, they're pieces of his story. He wanted someone to find them. "But what do we do now?" Rachel asked. Emily looked back at the house. "We finish what he started." Back in their hotel room, Emily laid the letter from Charles carefully on the desk. It felt heavier now, not physically but emotionally, as though the soldier's anguish had soaked into its paper fibers. The group sat in tense silence, each weighed down by the implications of what they'd uncovered. Margaret broke the silence first. "If Charles was trying to communicate something, it's through the piano. The letter, it's like a confession. He was haunted by something. Maybe it's connected to why he died." Rachel, still pale from their attic discovery, shook her head. "So what are we supposed to do? Hold a seance? Burn sage?" "No," Emily said firmly. We give him what he needs, acknowledgement. If guilt kept him tethered here, then maybe understanding his story, telling it, can help. Margaret nodded slowly. We've followed the breadcrumbs this far. But what if we're wrong? Then we'll have to live with that. But I think we owe it to him to try. The plan was simple, yet daunting. Revisit the plantation after hours and play the notes scratched into the attic floor. If they were wrong, it would be harmless. But if they were right, perhaps the music would give Charles peace or answers. The plantation was eerily quiet when they returned. The moon cast long shadows across the ancient oaks, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal hands. Emily gripped the flashlight tighter, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness. Are you sure no one's here? Rachel whispered. I double-checked the schedule, Margaret replied. The staff leaves at 9. But we need to move quickly, someone might still be patrolling. They slipped through the side gate, hearts pounding in sync with their hurried footsteps. The house loomed ahead, its windows black voids against the pale facade. Inside, the air was heavier than before, as if the walls themselves braced for what was to come. Emily led the way to the parlor, the others trailing behind like shadows. The piano sat waiting, its keys gleaming faintly in the flashlight's glow. Emily retrieved the notebook where she had copied the musical notes from the attic floor. She placed it carefully on the piano stand, her fingers trembling. Ready? She asked. Margaret and Rachel exchanged uneasy glances but nodded. Emily pressed the first key. The sound rang out, clear and sharp, cutting through the stillness. She played the next note, then the next, piecing together the melody like a fragile puzzle. As the song took shape, the room grew colder. The flashlight flickered, its beam faltering. Margaret exhaled sharply. Did you feel that? Before Emily could respond, the piano emitted a low, resonant chord, a note she hadn't played. The air thickened, carrying the faint scent of tobacco. A shadow passed across the room, not cast by their light but moving independently. Emily's fingers froze on the keys. Charles? She whispered. The room seemed to breathe, the walls groaning faintly as if exhaling centuries of secrets. The shadow coalesced near the piano, a faint outline of a man. His features were indistinct, but his presence was undeniable. Rachel gasped, clutching Margaret's arm. Oh my God! Emily steadied her voice. You're Charles, aren't you? You've been trying to tell us something. The figure didn't respond, but the air around them vibrated with unspoken tension. Emily continued, her voice soft but firm. We read your letter. We know you were hurting. You lost something or someone, didn't you? Was it Clarabelle? At the mention of the name, the figure flickered, then grew sharper. The piano let out a soft, mournful chord. Margaret stepped forward, emboldened. If you're still here because of what happened, we can help. But we need to know, what's keeping you tied to this place? The room grew colder still. The piano keys moved on their own, forming a slow, haunting melody. Emily recognized the tune. It was the same one she had pieced together in the attic. Maybe it's not about guilt, Emily murmured. Maybe it's about remembrance. He didn't want to be forgotten. As the melody faded, Emily's gaze fell on the letter. Something about its folds seemed off. She picked it up, running her fingers over the brittle paper. There's something inside, she said, carefully prying it open. Tucked within was a smaller, weathered note, its ink smudged but legible. It wasn't addressed to Clarabelle but to a daughter. The note was brief but devastating. My dearest Clara, if you find this, know that I loved you. Forgive me for not being there when you needed me most. I failed you and I failed your mother. The melody I play is my apology. A song of regret for the life I couldn't give you. Please forgive me. The room fell silent. The shadow by the piano seemed to bow its head, the weight of centuries-old sorrow lifting slightly. Rachel's voice trembled. His daughter. She must have lived here after him. But why would he write this and hide it? Margaret nodded slowly. Maybe he thought she'd find it. Or maybe he was too ashamed to give it to her directly. Emily placed the note back on the piano. Charles, we know your story now. You're not forgotten. You're forgiven. The shadow lingered for a moment longer before dissipating into the air. The coldness lifted, replaced by a strange warmth that settled over the room. The piano let out one final note, soft and resolute. Then all was still. Rachel exhaled deeply. Is it over? Margaret glanced around. I think so. He's at peace now. Emily ran her fingers over the keys, feeling a strange sense of closure. We did the right thing. As they left the plantation, the moonlight seemed brighter, the air lighter. The haunting weight of the house had lifted, leaving behind only the faint echo of a soldier's melody. Back at the hotel, the group reflected on their experience. Emily wrote down everything in meticulous detail, determined to preserve Charles's story. This isn't just a ghost story, she said. It's a human story, about loss, regret, and the need to be remembered. Margaret nodded. And maybe that's why places like Myrtle's plantation exist. Not to scare us, but to remind us of the lives that came before. Rachel managed a small smile. Well, I've had enough reminders to last a lifetime, but I'll admit, this was unforgettable. Years later, Emily published a book about their journey, intertwining historical research with their personal experiences. The story of Charles Beauregard and his haunting melody captured readers' hearts, reminding them that even in death, the human need for connection endures. And while the piano at Myrtle's plantation remains silent most nights, visitors occasionally report hearing a faint tune, a melody of regret and reconciliation, echoing through the halls.